guest, Praveen. He's our first expert in this year's DesTech Challenge. And thank you, Praveen, for taking your time to talk to our competition participants. We really appreciate it. Just give you a background about Praveen. So Praveen is an architect, urban designer, and a planner who works for a firm in Boston. And he's worked across all disciplines and a wide range of award-winning projects in India, Argentina, Afghanistan, Mexico, and the United States. So he will talk us through a selection of his projects. Okay, so Praveen's area of focus and research includes affordable housing and informal settlements, particularly in the developing world. And his expertise in the field for housing is broad, spanning from planning level strategies to built typologies. So without further ado, I want to hand over to Praveen to get today's session started. We will be taking some questions, so please put them, the usual in the chat, and then we can have a Q&A session. So Praveen, it's all yours. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Sheena, for introducing me. Thanks to you and Sabrish for enabling this platform. I think the competition is a great initiative and it's very timely. Without due delay, I'll just jump into the presentation. I just want to make sure I'm audible for everyone.
Can everybody hear Praveen? Is the audio good? If you could just, a few yeses in the chat would be great. Great, that's a yes. So.
Okay, do you all see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, so today, what I'm going to do is speak about a project which is relevant, where we have used data to the fullest in bringing out a framework which is the Sponge Handbook Chennai. And then probably later I'll talk a little bit about other projects as well, which are relating to data approaches, but you can see how the spectrum is very broad. And part 3, I'll just talk about some good practices to keep in mind when you work with data. First of all, I'll jump into the relevant project, the Sponge Handbook Chennai. So this is a project which, it was a competition under GIZ which we won in 2017-18. It was in 2018, and I was working here at Sasaki, but then I connected a few of the people in Chennai. I'm originally from Chennai, so we took on this competition and we won, and we worked as a consultant to the GIZ and the government of Chennai. We work under the name called Sponge Collaborative, and we are a collective where we are open-ended and we would collaborate when necessary. But the primary intent was to create awareness about landscape planning frameworks in India. So this is basically the broad layout of the Sponge Handbook, which we produced at the end of 3 months after the competition, working as a consultant with the city. But as I said, the idea is to bring in this idea of a sponge basin concept. As you might know, Chennai is surrounded by important river basins which feed drinking water and all drainage to the city. But the basic idea was to make them aware of, especially the bureaucrats, of how we need to move from a traditional stormwater management system towards a landscape approach, to invest in blue-green infrastructure and green infrastructures. And also studying Chennai's climate context about cloudburst events and water scarcity, which many of you might be aware of, where at one point in time there is no water in Chennai, whereas during monsoons it's flooded like crazy. And very similar to many of the Indian cities. All the metropolis suffer from this dual crisis, and climate change has only uh, increased the concerns. So the first thing, this was a competition. The competition which we won was for a canal in Chennai called the Buckingham Canal. But then we immediately realized the problem is not just at the canal, but it's the entire region. So we looked into uh, the whole basin approach, and we wanted to sort it out from the regional level at the scale. So this is all GIS data where we understood the blue systems, green systems, and we uh, uh, like identified all the water bodies. And it was surprising for a lot of people when you visualize these many water bodies here. Again, we used uh, satellite imagery data from previous years to show how the city has drastically grown in the last decade or couple of decades. Again, this is where it was helpful, where we had a marshland in 1991, but you can see the amount of urbanization which has come about surrounding the marshland. And also the idea of the sponge landscapes, which we call is, which have the duality, which during summer would shrink, but then when it's the rainy season, it would expand. That's pretty much the context of Chennai's water bodies, being a monsoon-fed city. So we had to show them how the idea of a sponge exists in reality, and you can see in the 2018 how urbanization has encroached upon. We looked into a few more water bodies and context from Chennai. Again, the power of, you can see the power of satellite imagery uh, uh, in building such an argument. So the biggest argument which we wanted to make again was to invest in open spaces, in green infrastructure, so that you will have less flooding, less runoff, more for infiltration. Whereas on the right side, what you see is a fully built up environment. So we came up with these four simple principles at the basin-wide scale and also the city scale, where you need to protect whatever system is there, delay the water as much as you can through landscape. Again, whenever there's an opportunity, you need to store, and you need to release the water in a very organized way, and especially talking about infiltration. So again, these were all complex data. Even when you present, these are GIS data, but we use the power of diagrams, visually appealing diagrams, to convey to the bureaucrats. And also we had a lot of community engagement. So this was very helpful. This was very helpful for the people when we presented, when we said, if you don't do nothing and the city grows towards the west, your water, when it rains, is gonna gush, and it's gonna create, your systems are gonna get overwhelmed. Whereas when you invest in a sponge basin scenario where you protect the wetlands or you protect all the catchment areas upland, and also invest in sponge landscapes, you would be able to control the water flow, control the runoff, and be able to manage flooding and droughts in a much better way. So we propose a sponge basin where you protect existing sponge landscapes, which are basically your beaches, rivers, all natural systems are sponge landscapes, whereas you introduce more into the system in the urban built environment. And we created a case for it. We showed diagrams which can explain these. And then we also were working with a lot of different government entities. So we identified all the stakeholders across levels who would do the protect, and what bodies or agencies will be involved in delay, what would be involved in store and release. Uh, okay, so we spoke about a sponge approach for a basin scale. Quickly, we realized we need a lot of data. Uh, Again, there are, sometimes you get lucky, you get all the data. Even working with the government, sometimes you might not be able to access data, but we just put it out to build an entire comprehensive framework at the city scale and beyond the city scale into the basins. As you can see, the gray is the city, but then the boundary of the basins or the catchment or the rivers are much more beyond. You need to start looking after them. So, and also you need a large variety of data sets. Like you need to map the existing natural systems, you need the soil map, groundwater levels, aquifer, high resolution, land cover. That's when you can have a very efficient uh, framework. So you need to plan from the regional scale into the detailed scale, where you need to jump from basin scale to district scale to city scale to ward scale, which is very important. But for this competition, we worked with whatever basic data that was available. Um, we did our own analysis. Again, I would just remind you about the project. This is for a canal. We are looking at a regional level, trying to understand open space systems. So we studied the topography, green systems, whatever areas low-lying, uh, urban land cover, the roads, and what was interesting is why the basin approach. We need to build a comprehensive framework beyond the city boundaries. It's because again through GIS, when we analyze data, we realized there are 6 basins in the city of Chennai. This is South Chennai, where are 3 basins. There are around 364 administrative units, and 284 of them are villages outside Chennai. So you can imagine the implications of it. How do you bring in a regulation? It's not just the corporation. You'll have to unify or try to bring in a common approach in these many bodies. Again, this is a big argument to the government. Again, data enabled and data visualization enabled us to show this to the government and build a big argument. So to tackle this, we studied these and we took an approach called the landscape infrastructure toolkit approach, where we came up with typologies that the city could start with before building the entire framework, where you could have sponge streets, sponge open spaces, and sponge buildings, which we call them. Um, so we came up with a toolkit of a kit of parts of these uh, constructed typologies which could be plugged in. Again, the top row is the streets, and you could have open spaces and then the buildings. So what these are basically are open spaces into your normal systems, not just the stormwater drainage, which allow for water to flood, to percolate. And also they are good in terms of improving public realm. There could be parks which will come out of it. There could be interactive typologies. There could be these are all open space typologies as well, and the buildings have their own capacity to store water. So I will not get into detail of these, but I'm just going to flip through where, again, because of the knowledge of data about Chennai's context, and we literally could not find a framework where we could put it in every street and every corner, but we gave them the toolkits with the criterion, selection criterion, like if you got to use this toolkit, the slope should be percentage should be 15 percentage, and the minimum water table depth should be 12 meter. Again, when we talk about sponge, sometimes the water infiltrates, sometimes the water stagnates, and both are sponge properties, as we call it, because you need to let the water to find its place in the um, land rather than being concrete or asphalt. So we gave the suitability matrix to them, where each toolkit would be analyzed based on cost and whatever site criterions, and the city would take the best decision, or the implementing agency would take the best decision based on whatever is there. Again, this is another open space typology which we came about with, the building typologies. But then when we had to produce the framework, we looked at a holistic approach where you need to plan it out for a span of, all this is not going to happen in a matter of 2 years or 3 years. When you plan this, it's going to take 30, 40 years, and we were very clear about it. So we showed them for the competition, yes, we need to think regionally, but also at the basin scale, at the site specific scale. We looked at, again, use data to understand water systems at the site level. And again, we really zoomed into the ward level, where the Buckingham Canal, we took a stretch where we studied the blue systems. Again, we also studied, as you, I don't know if you can see, but there are these streets which flood. Again, we used flooding data to understand which streets often flood. So again, those would become your streets for sponge street toolkits. We looked at open spaces where you have opportunities to convert them into sponge open space toolkits. That was the idea. Uh, and still we took a stab at the framework, which was pretty, I would say this is probably a 90% framework, because we did not have groundwater data, but it did not stop us from giving a framework, and told them use the toolkits wisely. When I say them, it's the city and all the agencies. Use these toolkits wisely based on your knowledge and whatever we have mapped, and let's try from this area. But the aspiration for this project is a project in Copenhagen called the Cloudburst Plan. And also they have done it again in New York City, where they are all the data sets which we had mentioned, which we unfortunately could not get access to in Chennai. Once you have that, you can get into the resolution of identifying which streets should have which typology of sponge infrastructure or blue-green infrastructure. Um, and New York City has done it, and Copenhagen has done it, and it's time that we do it. Again, so this is all the framework, setting up the framework, and then we jumped into the canal itself, which is again is in a pathetic state, like many other water bodies, many of the Indian cities. So what it is today is this, whereas we propose the authority to slope the edge so that you have more flood capacity and also improve public realm and create value. We identified a lot of these edges, and again, data helped us to understand flooding and whatnot. So we looked at scenarios of development where, yes, it's not just about the canal. In short term, you can use a sponge street toolkits to reimagine the streets, use some of a sponge open space to look at the open space abutting it, and also the canal, and you could have resettlement housing in the canal, which is again sponge buildings. So this is a scenario which we built, and again the edge could be different at different sections, depending on how you treat, and there could be multiple stakeholders who would develop these. So we wanted to demonstrate these ideas, how these toolkits, which evolved out of a stronger understanding of the context and data, we wanted to demonstrate in a site and show a pilot project which fit in our framework. So this is the site which we chose along the canal. Again, I would not get too much into the details, because just to get the larger idea. So we told them this is the site today. In the short term, in the next five years, invest in the sponge street toolkits, which we spoke about, S1, S2, S3. Probably that's the first project you could do. And then what it enables is open up the land close to the canal and create access, tactical urbanism. Just showing drawings also to the government bodies how these sponge street toolkits work with the existing stormwater drains and help in flood mitigation and storing water. That's in the short term, but in the medium term is when you will have a big project like the canal softening, which I spoke about, or the removal of the wall and sloping of the edge happens. So once that happens, you create and enable access to the canal front. And you could, in another 5 years, you could deploy these open spaces. The sponge, again, we use the sponge toolkit, the sponge open space toolkit here, which could come up. And eventually you'll have land value increasing. Use it in a positive way. Don't relocate people, but resettle them with housing typologies. Again, these housing typologies also are toolkits, which would come about. And then, as you could see, P3, P2 are all sponge building toolkits. So what we established was, over a span of 10 years or 20 years, that's when you finish your streets, when you create your open spaces, open the canal and introduce buildings, that's when you're really creating a sponge performative area, or a place which uh, is very sound and good in water management, in storing and in um, flood management. This is just the project itself which we told them. But it was important for us to build this incrementally and explain the clients, which was a city, to sell this vision. What I'll show is, okay, that's just one piece of the project. But if you start applying it to the entire city, which would happen over some years, you have a lot of potential. Uh, the entire stretch which I spoke about, where we created a framework, we showed what all open spaces could become sponge open spaces, what all streets need to become sponge streets, what all buildings can store water in the roofs and everything. Again, I would not waste a lot of time. These are design concepts which you might be aware of. Again, the housing settlement, which I spoke about. Again, this is a typology. We created strong visual narrative, which explains and takes the idea to the government and also to the community. Again, one of the sponge open space typology close to the water body, sloped edge. This is again a sponge open space typology inside a park, where you can recreate an existing park and let water stagnate or percolate, so that you take the water away from the streets and manage flooding. Again, when you open up the canal, as I mentioned, this is what happens. You create an ecological realm, and again, it helps in your real estate. Yeah, it creates a very active public realm. Um, and we took it a bit further, where we looked at other opportunities as well. You could even have new neighborhoods planned around the idea of the sponge, close to a station. It could be transit oriented development, where we looked at how a metro station could have sponge open spaces. And in all these drawings, if you see, you would have these annotations B1, B2, or P3, which relates to the sponge typologies or the toolkits which I spoke about at the beginning. Again, this is a building. We could have building typologies. It could have open spaces in the middle. The courtyards could store water. And again, they could be open spaces when it's dry season. They could be children play area in dry season when it floods, it stores water. Again, you could have schools conserving water. Your playgrounds can be graded and made to store water. You could have social housing, which could enable things, economic activities like lavoirs or shrimp farming and whatnot. Um, and again, these hubs, transit hubs, can become hubs of activity as well. With the, you could see one sponge landscape where this is again an visualization through the housing typology. So that's pretty much about the project, where I think it was useful when we took a toolkit approach, because again, what might be helpful for you all to know is, working in a context like India, there might always be data gaps which you should take into account. So sometimes a toolkit approach helps, where you have a range and you know it fits in the range, and you could deploy it depending on whatever it is. But the the outcome was very positive. It was well received by the Metro Water of Chennai City, and then the PWD body. The corporation was very appreciative of our work, where they took the handbook, they have it in their offices. Hopefully, there will be more engagements for us with them, so that we build the framework which we spoke about over a few years. Um, okay, so now in part two, I'll just not get into details, but just explain other projects where data has played a vital role. Uh, I would not get into details of those projects, but just these are just um, projects to as an inspiration. I know data-driven approaches in catching up in India, but for a lot of young graduates, or probably you're all in school, so since you are in the early part of your career, it might be interesting to look at some of these projects and start um, looking at data a bit more seriously. So the first one I'm going to talk about is data and design for shaping urban growth and development. This is a project which I did under Sasaki Associates in Boston, where we were hired to uh, develop frameworks for the 5 cities of Afghanistan in 2018. In 2017, we worked on the Kabul Urban Design Framework. This time it was the next 5 cities, which included Jalalabad, Herat, Mazari Sharif, and Kandahar and Khost. So we worked with a this was a World Bank funded project. We worked with the Ministry of Urban Development, and the president of Afghanistan was directly involved, the office of the president, and it was a very intense and an engaging process. Again, I started off with this map where a country like Afghanistan, there are a lot of returnees or IDPs. IDPs are internally displaced people, and this happened because Afghanistan has a lot of geopolitical issues and wars. So people are always displaced, and there is a flux of incoming population to the cities. Well, data is one, but data visualization is something else which has a lot of power. So this again shows you, if you see these colors, the thickness of the lines um, indicate the magnitude or the scale, and the dots represent the villages from which people are moving because of war and other reasons into the cities. This built a huge argument to build a framework which is inclusive for refugees and everybody. So again, something to remember is how we visualize data so that it's effective. Again, this is a complex project where we had quite a bit of data, much more than Chennai, where we looked at a lot of data sets, and we did a lot of Boolean and created what we call a spatial framework. This is just a framework for a city called Kandahar, where we studied all landscape assets. We studied where the city is growing, all the nodes. We studied wherever the aquifers are. We studied wherever the big river systems are. And we, based on analysis, told them the city is going to grow 5 times in the next 10 years or 20 years, but make sure you don't grow into areas which are ecologically sensitive. So the yellows talk about where you need to mitigate growth, and other areas where you can control growth, other areas where you should invest in landscape infrastructure to make sure you grow cautiously, and areas where you should grow. So this is a spatial framework which we gave the city to guide growth. Um, Studying all the natural systems, the green systems. And also we showed through GIS and data analytics how if you don't plan, the city is going to grow like this, growing into your valuable agriculture land, growing into your river systems or the mountains. Again, growing in an ecological sensitive area is going to be a crisis for the people and also for the city, which you might all know. Whereas on the right side is a planned scenario where you plan or direct growth in a way so that you can encompass all the growth in a different part of the city, not in the vulnerable ecological zones. And the drawing you saw, which we created, came out of by merging or layering a lot of data sets, from built up area to slope to watershed to open spaces to agricultural lands. And also we created an algorithm to see based on the nodes and the corridors which we created, how the development pans out. Again, these are all complex stuff which you will get into some point of time if you really pursue this, but just to give you an idea of how this is important. And producing this is very valuable. What you should understand is the bearing it has if you can guide growth of a city, which is going to become, these cities are 1 million today, they're going to become 10 million soon or 5 million. So you're saving billions and billions of dollars by guiding the growth in the right direction, and thousands of lives. And that's what happens in most of our Indian cities, where we grew haphazardly. And whenever it floods or whenever there's a drought, because we are in the vulnerable zones, we lose lives and billions of dollars. So data has so much power in urban planning and regional frameworks. So with all these, we created a framework again, bit more. This is what we call a strategic framework, where we told where not to grow, where to grow, but at the same time, in places where you cannot control the urbanization is going to happen. Again, we showed at the zoomed-in scale about how you need to invest in open spaces, public realm, streets which have blue-green infrastructure. Again, these are just images. I will not get into detail, but we did go into the detail. If you see the diagram in the right corner, we do have some of the toolkits which I spoke about, right? The street toolkits, how it's important to plan from the regional scale to the detailed scale. The next project I'm going to talk about, again, this is a project which I did in UC Berkeley. It's an academic project as well as um, a professional project. Now, data and design is becoming more and more important in the age of climate crisis. Whereas you have these contexts of duality where you have droughts and you have floods. Um so it's, I think it's important for young designers for you to uh, start imbibing some of these. And I'll just explain this project which we did. So this is in San Francisco Bay Area, in the west coast of United States, where we studied the San Francisco Bay Area in detail. And again, we created inundation models uh, to show what happens when the sea level rises, or when there is a storm surge, or when there is a cloud burst event. So it's not just flooding from the seaside, but also flooding from the rivers and everything. And we had data from scientists which say that the sea level is going to increase by 1.4 meter in the next 60 years. So what we did was, with all the data sets, we created an inundation model where, if it happens, what area is going to flood. So the light blue you see on the land is all the cities or areas which is going to flood in the San Francisco Bay Area. And it's very simple. You just do the contour. You get a terrain map from the DEM data. And if it's 1.4, just trace 1.4 contour into the land and you'll know like where it's going to flood. But it was pretty bit more complex than what I'm explaining, where we used storm, even flood maps which were created when there was a huge storm. So all these combined together, we created this inundation model. So in that context of Bay Area, I looked into two cities. One is San Francisco, and another one is East Palo Alto. East Palo Alto, poor city, in poor in terms of economics or demographics compared to San Francisco. And again, these inundation models which we created were super helpful in building an argument towards creating a resilient framework. So this is with, without flooding, or with flooding in, without, when the sea level is 0 meters. When the sea level is going to increase by 0.5 meters, you're going to have this much flooding. Again, 1 meter, 1.4 meter, you can see how much of inundation is actually happening. Um, well, this, when I said this was also, this is an academic project as well as a professional project, because we worked with the Bay Area Planning Commission. We were the first to produce this, and the Bay Area Resilient by Design competition happened later. So what it enabled us was, when I did this, when we did these inundation models for San Francisco, it helped me draw a framework which reflects to inundation. As you could see, some of these gridded streets are flooding. So we came up with a strategy. Yes, you need to have a barrier kind of a system, a flood wall or a levee. But at the same time, the best way to play with water is not by obstructing it, but by playing with it. If you see a lot of projects in Netherlands, the Dutch do it. So you need to allow water to get into the fabric. So this was just a framework which we created. And again, getting into the details when you do that. So this is the levee which I was talking about, or the flood barrier, where the street grows incrementally. But at the same time, on the other side of the bay, you create spaces or opportunities for water to stagnate. and how your streets could take in the water. Now, this is the other city which I spoke about, East Palo Alto. Now, when you plan for resilience, it's important to understand other issues as well surrounding it, and you always connect the dots. That's when you come up with a better opportunistic design, which I call. So East Palo Alto, when we looked into it, it was a low income neighborhood. There was already a housing burden. So what we did was connected the dots and created, yes, flood landscapes, but also created opportunities for housing, more housing, which will help the cost. And also the housing market would, or the housing real estate would help pay for all these big infrastructures, which I'm talking about. The city could fund these or finance these through land value capture, and a lot of other techniques are there. So this is just an example of, again, the kind of details which we went into from the model. Now, talking about shaping the public realm, now kind of zooming into another level now. We spoke about regional level, city level, but this is again an open space level. So this is a project again which I work under Sasaki. This is a campus planning master plan for Emory University in Georgia, United States, where we wanted to create a plan, a master plan, and a framework for the campus, an existing campus already, but we were hired to do the open space in the public realm. We used crowdsourced data, used student data through apps and online platforms, and also we used data of all the, when you enter a building, you have these fabs, right? So through that, we were able to understand what are the circulation patterns, how are they clustered. Uh, Through that, we were able to shape the public realm. We were able to identify which are the most crowded areas or what are the most frequent trips inside the campus. And in the bottom right, you could see how that shaped the public realm, which you see in yellow. Um, Again, we do a lot of these at Sasaki, where we use data directly as an evidence to create frameworks. Um, Now coming to primary versus secondary data. Now all GIS data, the data which is spatially mapped, is what we call in the fraternity as secondary data. Which you might probably know. Secondary data is all geospatial data is secondary data. So, but then there is also primary data, which is on-site observations. Like let's say you have an open space, you go to the site, you do interviews, you do surveys, you do observations firsthand, which we call as primary data, whereas secondary data is more the spatial data. So this is just a project which I did. I'll just tell you about it without getting the detail, where we had to study 3 parks in Berkeley, trying to understand the safety levels of each of the parks. So we studied the secondary data. Again, this is all from the online resources. We found out crime data, which is safer. At the same time, primary data is, as I mentioned, we went to the parks, we mapped people, we did on-field surveys, we did interviews, um, we did it at regular intervals. So what was interesting is when we compared the secondary versus primary, sometimes you might be surprised about the assumptions. So initially, when we looked into the secondary data or the geospatial data, some of the parks scored very badly in terms of safety. Whereas when we reached out to people there, the perception of people using those parks were much different. They felt it was safer. So it's always good to validate data, and especially if in this competition and also in the future, you're going to work with open spaces. Yes, you should do your analysis through all your geospatial data, do the secondary data analysis, but also never underestimate the power of on-site surveys or going and reaching out to people or doing your own observations and mapping. The best approach is to balance both, is what I think. Again, which is what I'm going to come to, like talking about good practices. Um, Well, all these projects might be a bit overwhelming because it was overwhelming for me when I got introduced. But what is important to understand is, yes, everybody would get there, but it's important to understand how valuable it is to start imbibing an evidence-based approach in design right from this age. Um, Trying to look at data, trying to do your analysis. So one practice would be to layer data, like how, if you have geospatial data, or whatever sort of data you, even if you don't do it digitally, use your butter sheets or tray sheets, layer them and find the overlaps and discrepancies. This is probably the best approach when you start. Again, the next one which I would suggest is data validation. uh, yes, there will be data sets which you need to look into. Again, do your field research and contemplate and compare between the both. The third one, which I would say is, take all the connecting the dots approach is, let's say you're working on um, flooding and open spaces and green systems, but always look into other data sets or other issues. If there is a housing issue, if there is a gender issue, when you connect all these dots, that's when you can build a comprehensive framework, and it will be helpful in many cases. So don't look, just look into, focus into a single issue. Well, that's pretty much it. Thank you. So we work under the name Sponge Collaborative. It's an open collective where professionals across the world combine. You could follow some of our works if you find them interesting, and also reach out if you need any sort of academic guidances, or if you want to collaborate in some research. Thank you.
Thank you, Praveen. That was amazing. That was excellent. Thank you so much. We'll just sort of give you some, if anybody has any questions, please paste your questions in the chat. The session has been recorded, so it will be uploaded on World Labs as soon as it's been edited. Darshana, did you have anything to add or any comments from your behalf?
No, I think it's, Praveen, I think this session is incredibly useful. I have learned so much from this. I have about 12, 13 years of experience in the industry, but believe me, I've learned so much today within this hour that I haven't
Okay.
heard of before. So thank you ever so much for that. I think the points that you brought out to your presentation, particularly about designers being able to at least navigate the field of data, that I felt was incredibly strong, and it's something that we are actively pursuing through this competition. What was fantastic to see is how you have managed to make that transition from collection of data to analysis to deriving insight and then integrating that into your design. Before students start, I hope there are questions coming through. um, I have a question from my end. um, Coming from a design background, how easy or difficult did you find understanding the the field of data, which is so much more definitive or more technical in that way? So how did you navigate that? Did you have the aptitude you felt towards it, or did you just evolve yourself into it?
I think, I mean, I was interested in problem solving from the beginning, but at the beginning, data was a bit overwhelming for me. When I did my master's or worked at Sasaki. Um, but I think the key here is for the students, and talking from my own personal experience, is to take it slow. And there are a lot of strategies, there are a lot of tech specialists who can help you, you'll probably collaborate. I think having an open mind to collaboration and everything will help. um, but to take it slow, I think it's the simple steps which we might have learned in school, is to, whenever we do an urban design exercise, use a trace sheet, layer them, uh, take it simply, uh, uh, take it in a step by step. incremental manner than actually trying to do everything. But at Sasaki or at Berkeley or at the places I've worked in, we had specializations only, people who knew design and also coding, who can come up with softwares anytime, which I think is catching up in India. We would definitely in the coming years have such experts.
No, brilliant for that insight, because I completely get your point. Data analytics is an overwhelming field, particularly if you come from a creative background and you've already invested so much of time and energies to upskill yourself in a particular domain, isn't it? There's one question from the students. I think what they want to know is, what were your problems, or what are the problems that you may have faced when you've tried to overlap data? Perhaps I could rephrase this to say overlap and probably trying to link different types of data together.
Mm-hmm. I think also to answer to your previous question, it's partly connected to that. So when you have too many data sets, uh, uh, what the first thing is, you visualize them. You put it on a map, and you like overlap all of them. You need to be good at visualizing them in terms of either a drawing, and then what happens is, I think designers are very good with data because of our um, critical thinking or design thinking, which I call. So once you visualize and convert them into a more digestible form, and for designers, it's a drawing, be it a butter sheet or be it an illustrator drawing or whatever. Once you get it to that stage and overlap, I'm sure it will be easy for you to identify overlaps or identify discrepancies, or your brain would start processing, why is this, um, especially in a low income neighborhood, there is a lot of loss of value and there is a lot of flooding. So you start focusing on those. I don't know if I answered the question properly. It was
No, I
like
think you're pretty spot on there. I think you've broken it down, and you're right in saying, you've got to layer it up in an effective way and sort of break down the process as well. I've got another question for you, Praveen. It says, can you brief us about the Boolean operation in layer overlapping? I think it's probably referring to one of your previous slides where you probably had something to do with Boolean values or something
I
related
mean,
to data.
what we call in Boolean is either you do and, or the basic gates, or in other words, it's subtraction, addition, inverse, or exclusive. Um, so once you have these data sets, I don't know if I can remember a specific example to point out.
I'm assuming they picked the word up from one of your slides.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
maybe that might be.
So let's say I'm trying to give an example because these are hard to explain. So let's say I'm trying to find out, again, the same example of flooding and demographics. Um, I want to, let's say I'm a city, I want to invest and help the poor from a socialistic point of view. First, invest in poorer areas. So, what is the easiest Boolean you would do is look at the flooding data or inundation model, find out where it's going to flood. Then, just next layer is apply your uh, income levels, or informal versus formal development layer from your land cover data. So once you overlap these, again, that's a Boolean operation, right? Where you pick out areas of flooding which are vulnerable, which are places where you have informal neighborhoods, then you start focusing there. So this is the basic Boolean which I spoke about. And again, it is a process. You will start understanding once you have the data set how intelligently I could extract an argument from multiple data. Should I add or subtract or take the difference, something which you will explore once you start playing with it.
And that's really useful. So either you're trying to take some subsets of the same information, or you're categorizing different things. Is that
Yeah.
where you're coming
Yeah,
from?
exactly. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Got one more question for you. There is so much to learn as we start off with the initial stages of some problem solving. Things are so scattered. What do you suggest we should do while we start the process of design to become more specific towards the problem?
That's a
I
good
think it's a
question.
bit more generic, but I feel there is a sentiment of overwhelming sort of nature of there's so much to actually figure out, isn't it? What are the stages? How do we go about problem solving step by step?
I think the value of primary data, which I spoke about, right? Like when you do a site analysis, start not just start getting these observations or do your on-field surveys, do interviews. But then the important thing is to catalog this data. These are also data into ways you could process them, right? So I think the first step would be to focus on improving primary data on the parallel. Also try learning GIS approaches, learning ArcGIS or QGIS. Uh, and even if you don't do GIS, look into online sources like OpenStreetMaps. Just download images and trace them out. I think that's when you have to have a multi disciplinary approach to any problem. Look at issues from different lenses and layer them. I think that's probably the first step to start. Uh, Eventually, you will improve all your skill sets towards GIS or other softwares.
Okay, no, that's absolutely brilliant. There is one more question on the forum. I feel it's not too intensive. Is there any procedure of overlapping data, or does it depend on the location and the problem? I mean, from my perspective, I can clearly see it is dependent on the location and problem.
Yeah.
But I probably think it might benefit if you just elaborated a bit more on the process of overlapping, perhaps. Or, as you said, would it just be like using softwares like GIS and simple manual processes? Again, reiterating that point, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty much the same, but I think you need to probably be consistent with the scale or the form of representation, so you can do it. One data set cannot be in the form of just tabular column or Excel, right? When you are going to do it on a map, set a scale, set your parameters, and always remember to read the assumptions of the data. And I think I think it's just taking out your sketch pens and tracing. That's it. In whatever form, express it out, because um, I think for a designer, the first step in data analytics is your drawings or your diagrams or your scribblings. I would say. Then we can learn about complex processes probably.
Thank you. That's super reassuring. We will not, give away our pens and pencils and all the sketch pens for code. I think that's a very really really useful insight. What I would like us to do now, very quickly, Praveen, is I just wanted to let you know that the students have worked so hard over the last few months. For the first time, we've managed to collect data for 30 different cities. The students have really applied themselves, learned QGIS on the go as well. And I feel we have a whole new sort of fantastic bunch of students coming out with all these new skills. Do you have any words of sort of parallel processes that you've seen around? And what I would like us to communicate here is, the power of what they've actually done through this. From an external person as such as yourself, I just want the students to understand that they've actually done a really powerful exercise together, which is hard to find actually.
Mm-hmm. You want me to elaborate on parallel process?
Yeah, I mean, just wondering if there have been other attempts of such level of crowdsourcing, and what is the value of such data coming together?
Mhm. I think, I mean, today in the today in this age, I think it's there are a lot of online resources, web-based sources. Needn't just be data sets, ArcGIS data set, or you need to get from the Bhuvan, or any other government sources. But I would say, like, look around for data. Like I said, Street Maps, or I know for Chennai there is an organization called Urban Risk Mitigation. We were not able to get data on which streets would flood, but you go into their website. They are a group from out of MIT. They have mapped out all the streets that flooded during 2015, and again, it's a crowdsourced data. Um, so it might come in handy for most of you, where you look into these open platforms. You might be able to get what you need. Um, and if you're looking at using crowdsourced data, this I'm not sure, but if you dig around, you might be able to find platforms that are for free, uh, or apps which can help users participate. And if you have a sample user group, like it's you 40 people around an open space which you want to interview, there are free softwares or apps where they could feed in their interview. So look for these free resources, which I think there are so many. um, yeah, I don't know
That's
if I.
brilliant. Absolutely, yeah. No, absolutely spot on. I Perhaps we are coming towards the end of the session, Pareen, but thank you ever so much. Fantastic session. We will put all of this online for you to revisit and have a look at. And
Yeah.
we will shortly be putting across the process for phase 2 of design.
Mm-hmm.
We've had a fantastic, absolutely fantastic response. So we'll keep you in the loop as well to show how the students are progressing through this journey. And yeah, I hope to sort of meet you in another session soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to the outcome of this competition. Uh, as I said, it's very timely and very important. I'm sure we're going to have some exciting content. It's going to come out.
Absolutely, absolutely. This bunch of students are absolutely inspiring. So I am pretty sure, I'm super confident there will be fantastic outputs coming out.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Praveen, thank you.
Bye-bye.
See you all.
Bye bye. Thank you, everyone.